In this lesson, we're continuing to talk about the various different institutions of the European Union for the purposes of our study within European Union law. In the last lesson, we looked at the European Council, and in this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the Council of the European Union. Two different institutions, I would like to add. In fact, there are, as I mentioned in earlier lessons, in fact, three different quote-unquote European councils, if you will. There are two that are associated with the European Union, and then there is, of course, the Council of Europe, which is associated with the European Convention on Human Rights. Not very easy to understand for law students, but this is just something that you have to get your head around quite early when studying European law, is that there are three different councils. This lesson, as I said, is going to talk about the Council of the European Union. We'll talk about the general role of the Council, we'll talk about the powers of the Council, and we'll talk about the configuration of the Council before finally examining the President of said Council, in an effort to essentially define and outline the main powers and functions of the Council of the EU. Like I said, and like I will make one more mention of now, is that we will delineate, and we have to delineate, between the Council of the European Union and the European Council. These are separate institutions within the EU, and both of these are separate to the Council of Europe, which is a non-EU institution entirely. So let's begin then by talking about the Council of the European Union. It is the main European Union institution which is said to represent the main interests of the member states. So this is supposed to have the member states' interests in mind when making and deliberating on decisions. Just like with the previous institutions of the European Union, the powers and functions of the Council of the EU is found in the Treaty on the European Union, specifically in Article 16. So Article 16 says the following. It says that the Council shall, jointly with the European Parliament, exercise legislative and budgetary functions. It shall carry out policy making and coordinating functions as laid down in the treaties. So it has a dual authority in relation to the kinds of powers that the Council of the EU has. So it exercises legislative and budgetary functions, and it does so in conjunction with the European Parliament. The Council shall consist of representatives of each member state at ministerial level, who may commit the government of the member state in question and cast its single vote, depending on the member states. The Council shall act by way of qualified majority, except where the treaties provide otherwise. So this is just talking about who represents members of the Council of the EU, so it shall consist of representatives from the ministerial level of the member states. And then secondly, the Council shall act by way of qualified majority. This is just explaining to us what the kind of voting system is when we look at the treaties and we look at the ways the Council of the EU makes decisions. And it says that this will be qualified majority unless the treaties provide otherwise. So if it's expressly stated in the treaties that unanimity or a simple majority or a supermajority may be required, then this is really where we see a change in the voting patterns and voting structures. I'm going to skip towards the end of this provision, given that there are some elements in the middle that aren't entirely too relevant for our purposes, and we'll just go down to Part 7, because Part 7 says that a committee of permanent representatives of the governments of member states shall be responsible for preparing the work of the Council. And then finally, the Council shall meet in public when it deliberates and votes on a draft legislative act. We'll get to what those are in future lessons. To this end, each Council meeting shall be divided into two parts, dealing respectively with the deliberations on Union legislative acts and non-legislative activities. So, if you want to know the powers, the functions, the authorities, the structure, and the voting within the Council of the European Union, you can look to Article 16, where it outlines all of this in great detail. And so when we think about this and we start to unpack Article 16 in more detail specifically, we'll begin by looking at what the configuration of the Council may be, sometimes described as the Council of Ministers. The reason why is because it is made up of the ministers of member states. So it is made up of members from each of the individual EU member states who have ministerial status, who are at a ministerial level. It will also exist in a number of configurations depending on the particular policy agenda that is on issue as an issue at that time. So given the fact that ministers and individuals within politics who have ministerial authority will have ministerial authority within a particular policy area. So you might have a minister for health, or a minister for defence, or a minister for education. These essentially ensure that the configurations of the council will depend on the particular policy agenda. So depending on the particular agenda at the time, we will see a particular set of ministers who will make up the Council of the European Union, or the Council of Ministers. Now, there are 10 in total different policy areas for which the council may be concerned, and these 10 are as follows. You have employment and social policy, at which point, if that is the configuration of the council, it means that the ministers of member states who are responsible for employment and social policy will chair and be members of the council at that time. You also have transport, you have justice, you have environment, education, economic affairs, competitiveness, agriculture and fisheries, foreign affairs, and general affairs. So, generally speaking, what the configuration of the council does is outline quite a significant number of policy areas that any government should be concerned with. So every government should be concerned with education, with the economy, for example, with environment and justice, and foreign policy. And then they also add in a couple of ones which are still unique and important to member states, but also provide something of a unique and importance to the European Union, owing to the role and the competences that the European Union has. So, for example, agriculture and fisheries actually is something that is very important for the European Union because it has spent a lot of time developing its law, EU law, on agriculture and fisheries, with things like the Common Fisheries Policy, for example. So, if the agenda pertains to employment and social policy, as I've mentioned, it will be composed of ministers on the issue of employment and social policy, and that's how we really get some specialized situations where we have specific policy issues being at hand and the agenda being on a specific area of policy being dealt with and deliberated by specific ministers within those areas. Finally, then, the President of the Council. So the presidency of the council will be held by every single member state and will be done on a rotational basis. And the term of the presidency will be 6 months, and so as a result, and by basic simple arithmetic, the number of presidents per year will be 2. You'll have 2 member states who hold the position of president each year. Each member state which holds the presidency has the ability to set the policy agenda for their 6 months in control. So, for example, if France retains the presidency and then they become the ones in charge for the next 6 months, then it is up to France to make a determination, or it is up to the president of the council at that time, who would be a French minister, to essentially set the agenda for that particular period. So for the 6 months, maybe France decides that justice is on the agenda, and so as a result, the configuration of the council will be as such, and it will be dealing with issues of legislative and budgetary authority relating to things like justice.